Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Pulp Crazy. I'm your host, Jason Aiken. My apologies for not getting an episode up last week, but I hit a bit of a snafu in my reading and podcasting plans. I had planned on doing an episode on the Fritz Leiber Cthulhu Mythos short story, To Arkham and the Stars. But while I enjoyed this story, I suspect that I really need to read Lovecraft's The Whisper in Darkness to fully appreciate Leiber's tale. To Arkham and the Stars ties in with several Lovecraft tales, and while I've read the majority of them, I haven't read The Whisper in Darkness, and that seems to play a big role in Leiber's story. So, look for episodes on both The Whisper in Darkness by Lovecraft and To Arkham and the Stars by Leiber at a later date. Now, luckily, I finished listening to Fritz Leiber's Swords Against Death earlier this week, which is book 2 of the Fafhrd and Gray Mouser saga. So in this week's episode, I'll be discussing the collection Swords Against Death by Fritz Leiber. Unlike the first book in the Fafhrd and Gray Mouser series, Swords and Deviltry, which was comprised mostly of 3 critically acclaimed, and in 2 out of the 3 cases, award-winning novellas. Swords Against Death is made up of 10 short stories of varying length. A few of the short stories in Swords Against Death even appeared in pulp magazines. Now, as was the case with Swords and Deviltry, and all other installments of the Fafhrd and Gray Mouser series released under the Swords banner, these stories are arranged by internal series chronological order. And just to give you a quick lay of the land, so to speak, the Fafhrd and Gray Mouser stories take place on the world of Newan, which is an anagram of know when. The stories largely take place in and around the city of Lankhmar, which Fafhrd and the Gray Mouser use as their base of operations when they're not out adventuring across Newan. The first short in Swords Against Death is titled The Circle Curse. It picks up right after the concluding novella from Swords and Deviltry, Ill Met in Lankhmar. The Circle Curse was first published in Swords Against Death back in July of 1970, and it didn't appear as a single story in a magazine or any other publication prior to this that I'm aware of. The Circle Curse opens with Fafhrd and the Gray Mouser leaving the city of Lankhmar, following the tragic events of Ill Met in Lankhmar, where both men lost their lovers. Shortly after leaving Lankhmar, the pair encounter for the first time Sheelba of the Eyeless Face in the Great Salt Marsh just outside the city of Lankhmar. Sheelba will someday become the patron warlock of the Gray Mouser. In this particular short story, Sheelba appears in his or her magical hut and basically tells the 2 adventurers to just turn around and return to Lankhmar, and not to even waste their time with leaving. The adventurers ignore Sheelba's advice and continue traveling away from Lankhmar. Leiber gives us the high points of how Fafhrd and the Gray Mouser spent their next 3 years away from Lankhmar, trying to get over the deaths of their lovers. He doesn't get into too much detail, but he just gives us enough information to kind of get an idea of their great travels. The next significant event happens when the pair encounter Ningauble of the Seven Eyes, who will one day become Fafhrd's patron warlock. Fafhrd and the Mouser take refuge in a cave that connects to the subterranean caverns that are Ningauble's lair. These caverns are said to be connected to all of time and space, and they play a role in later stories, most notably Adept's Gambit, which appears in the next book of the Fafhrd and Gray Mouser series, Swords in the Mist. The pair descend into the subterranean realm and encounter Ningauble. Ningauble tells the duo that there's one place where they haven't tried seeking refuge from their grief, and that's the city of Lankmore itself. Ningauble then disappears. Fafhrd and the Gray Mouser discuss the encounter, and they debate on whether or not to return to Lankmore. But the two finally decide to return to Lankmore, after 3 years spent away. Now this was a pretty solid opening piece for the collection. It wasn't very long, but it was packed with a significant amount of detail. Plus, we got to meet Sheelba and Ningauble for the very first time. The next story, The Jewels in the Forest, was first published under the title of Two Sought Adventure in the August 1939 issue of Unknown, which was a pulp magazine. This particular variant, titled The Jewels in the Forest, was first published in Swords Against Death back in July 1970. The Jewels in the Forest takes Fafhrd and the Gray Mouser outside the city of Lankmore and into the southern countryside. They come across a page of thick, ancient vellum that describes the location of a great treasure. The rogues locate the structure where the treasure is hidden, a peculiar-looking, abandoned house. The two enter, but find the house has some interesting defenses. I really enjoyed The Jewels in the Forest, and thought it was a pretty unique sword and sorcery tale, especially considering what you could call the antagonist of the story. Thieves House first appeared in the February 1943 issue of Unknown Worlds. This story has Fafhrd and the Gray Mouser once again clashing with the Thieves Guild. If you enjoyed Ilmet and Lankmore, then this should be right up your alley. There are some cool eldritch scenes that take place within the bowels of Thieves House, the headquarters of the Thieves Guild in Lankmore. I think Leiber may be at his best in these Lankmore-based urban sword and sorcery tales. I've yet to read a tale that was primarily set in the city of Lankmore that I haven't thoroughly enjoyed. The Bleak Shore first appeared in the November 1940 issue of Unknown Fantasy Fiction, which was a pulp magazine. In this story, Fafhrd and the Gray Mouser are ensorcelled by a powerful force, and are compelled to leave the city of Lankmore and travel across the great ocean to the titular Bleak Shore, where the said force is waiting for them. I'm kind of in awe at Leiber's execution of the Bleak Shore. Structurally, it just shouldn't work as well as it does, but he manages to pull it off. He goes from his usual third-person omniscient voice to having a supporting character tell a decent portion of the story through dialogue, and then back to his normal third-person omniscient voice. And once the tale gets back to focusing on Fafhrd and the Mouser in Leiber's usual style, and away from the dialogue narration, it really takes off in my eyes. The Bleak Shore almost had me thinking it had some cosmic horror elements to it, a la Robert W. Chambers' The King in Yellow, in regards to Carcosa, but that turned out ultimately to not be the case. The Howling Tower first appeared in the June 1941 issue of Unknown Fantasy Fiction, which again was a pulp magazine. This picks up with Fafhrd and the Gray Mouser still on the other side of the ocean, where they encounter a haunted tower and its caretaker in the countryside. I should say that I kind of got the impression that they were still on the other side of the ocean. Don't take my word for it, though. Read it on your own, and you can make your own conclusions to that. But the Howling Tower wasn't bad. It really wasn't outstanding either, though. Since it's basically a ghost-type story, you can kind of see where it's going at a certain point. It lacked the unpredictability of the Bleak Shore, in my opinion. Although the mechanism of the purple alcoholic potion that Leiber has in here was pretty interesting. It's a solid story, but in my opinion, it's probably the weakest in this collection. The Sunken Land first appeared in the February 1942 issue of Unknown Worlds. This is a sea-based adventure that deals with Noon's version of Atlantis, Simorgia. During the course of the story, Fafhrd also runs across some fellow Northerners while on the open sea. Despite this short story being mostly a one-man show focusing on Fafhrd, I still enjoyed it a great deal. I loved the Tolkien-esque opening to the plot, with Fafhrd and the Gray Mouser fishing and finding an ancient ring/key. It was cool to see Fafhrd interacting with some Northerners from the Cold Waste again, too. And I thought the conclusion to this was appropriately weird, memorable, and very fitting. The 7 Black Priests first appeared in the May 1953 issue of Other Worlds Science Stories. This is a chase tale of sorts, with Fafhrd and the Gray Mouser being pursued on the borders of the Cold Waste by a sect of black priests, after the duo pilfer a holy object while passing through the area. This was a decent enough tale, and it had a nice twist at the end that all adventurers should be wary of. It's not one of the better stories in this collection, but it's still fairly enjoyable. I'd rank it slightly higher than the Howling Tower, due to the aforementioned twist. And it's because of this twist that I'd suggest all dungeon masters read this story for possible inspiration in their tabletop adventures. Claws from the Night first appeared in the fall 1951 issue of Suspense magazine. It was originally titled Dark Vengeance. This story deals with Fafhrd and the Gray Mouser taking on an ancient cult in the city of Lankhmar, against the backdrop of some strange thefts in the city. There is a strong avian theme present in this story. In my opinion, this is one of the best stories in the whole collection. As a matter of fact, Swords Against Death really closes out strong, as Claws from the Night and the next 2 short stories are all of a particularly high quality. The Price of Pain Ease first appeared in Swords Against Death back in July 1970. Now, at this point in their lives, both Fafhrd and the Gray Mouser are running errands from time to time for their respected patron warlocks. In The Price of Pain Ease, both Sheelba of the Eyeless Face and Ningauble of the 7 Eyes send their adventurer on a quest to retrieve the Mask of Death from the Shadowlands, and make each of them swear to a certain set of roles. This quest also ties in with the grief the two feel over the deaths of their lovers from Ilmet and Lankhmar. This might be the most appropriate story for a collection titled Swords Against Death, and it's cool to see Fafhrd and the Gray Mouser in a competition of sorts. Bazaar of the Bazaar first appeared in the August 1963 issue of Fantastic Stories of Imagination. This is the big one that closes out the collection. It's probably the most well-known story in the collection, too. Bazaar of the Bazaar is just a really clever and catchy title, after all. It's also a fun story. An otherworldly shop appears out of nowhere in Lankhmar's market and raises concerns for both Sheelba of the Eyeless Face and Ningauble of the Seven Eyes. The two sorcerers are aware of the threat this otherworldly shop presents and conspire together to have their two agents deal with it. Their plans are thrown into slight disarray when the Gray Mouser arrives at the shop early and falls under its spell, leaving Fafhrd to save the day. I'd say this is probably the most memorable and, again, iconic of all the stories in Swords Against Death. It's a great way to end the collection on a high note. So there you have it. 10 quality pieces of sword and sorcery short fiction from a master of fantasy and science fiction, Fritz Leiber. You can't go wrong with Swords Against Death. I own Swords Against Death in both ebook and audiobook formats. Both are available for an inexpensive price via Amazon Kindle and Audible. I can especially recommend the Audible audiobook, as I listen to it on my daily walks and really enjoy doing so. I'm currently listening to the third book in the Fafhrd and the Gray Mouser series, Swords in the Mist, and I gotta tell you, it's another good one. You can't go wrong with these Audible audiobooks. I especially enjoy the introductions by Neil Gaiman in these Audible audiobooks. I'll put a link to both the Amazon Kindle and Amazon audiobook in the show notes. I'll also link to my last episode covering Book 1 of the Fafhrd and Gray Mouser series, Swords and Deviltry. Well, that's it for this week's episode of Pulp Crazy. Pulp Crazy is located at pulpcrazy.com. I'm at Pulp Crazy on Twitter and facebook.com/pulpcrazy. I'm also now on Instagram at instagram.com/pulpcrazy. You can also email me at pulpcrazy@gmail.com. My author website is located at jasonscottaiken.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.